I was stirring dinner on the stove, letting the garlic sizzle the way James always said he loved, when my phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. I remember staring at the screen, feeling that small, inexplicable tug in my chest that whispers something is off. You know that kind of intuition we try to brush away? It wrapped around me in an instant. Still, I wiped my hands on a towel, reached for the phone, and answered. Mostly out of habit, partly out of curiosity I didn't want to admit. The voice that came through wasn't normal, distorted, calm in a way that made my skin prickle, not someone who dialed by mistake. And then those words dropped into my kitchen like a bomb. Your husband is cheating on you. Right now. No build-up, no hesitation. It felt like someone pulled the floor out from under me. My heart clenched so sharply that for a moment I forgot to breathe. I tried to ask who they were, what kind of joke this was supposed to be, but the voice just kept pushing, almost clinical, almost too certain to be lying, telling me he never worked overtime, telling me to look closer at his life. And when the call cut off, it left this heavy electric silence hanging in the room. I just stood there, spoon in hand, pulse racing, pretending I wasn't shaking, pretending I didn't feel something inside me shift in a way I couldn't yet explain. For a moment, I just stared at the wall, listening to the soft bubbling of the pan behind me, trying to convince myself the call meant nothing. People prank strangers all the time. Maybe someone dialed the wrong number. Maybe someone wanted to stir trouble. That's what logic whispered. But my body didn't believe it. My hands felt cold, and there was this strange weight in my chest, as if a truth I wasn't ready for was quietly settling in. I wanted to shake it off, really. I even tried to force a laugh at myself, thinking, Rachel, get a grip. But as I moved around the kitchen, continuing dinner, something felt different, like the air itself had shifted. I kept replaying the voice in my mind, the confidence in their tone, the certainty in their accusation. It wasn't someone guessing, it was someone who knew. And the worst part? A tiny part of me wondered if I already knew too. When James walked in later that evening, pretending everything was perfectly normal, I caught myself studying him in a way I hadn't before. The smell of a different cologne, the slightly rushed breath, the distracted look. Things I would have ignored yesterday suddenly felt loud. I didn't accuse him, not yet. I just observed, quietly, closely. And I hated that the voice of a stranger had cracked something open inside me that I could no longer close. That night, after James fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. It used to comfort me. But now, every sound felt amplified, every shift, every exhale, as if my body was trying to decide whether it was lying next to a husband or a stranger. I kept hearing the caller's last words. Look closer at his life. They echoed like a taunt, a warning, or maybe a truth I'd been avoiding for far too long. I thought about the little things I'd brushed off over the years, missed calls he never explained, subtle changes in routine, the nights he'd come home quieter than usual. At the time, I told myself every marriage had phases, ups and downs, moments of distance. But in that dark bedroom, those excuses suddenly felt flimsy, like old wallpaper peeling from the corners. It scared me to realize how much I had accepted just to keep the peace, just to believe in us. The next morning, I moved through the house in a haze, noticing everything with new eyes. His keys on the table, his jacket tossed over the chair, his phone face down, like it always was. Each detail felt like a clue waiting for me to stop pretending. And even though I tried to act normal, something inside me was already shifting into a different kind of awareness. A readiness I didn't fully understand yet, but one I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore for long. Over the next few days, it felt like my world shifted just a few degrees, subtle enough that no one else would notice, but sharp enough that I felt it with every breath. Every time James said the words overtime, something inside me tightened, like a string being pulled a little too hard. I kept telling myself I wasn't that woman, the suspicious type, the one who snoops or assumes the worst. But the anonymous call had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter I couldn't pull out. One evening, as he grabbed his keys and announced he'd be working late again, my heart skipped in that uneasy way I was starting to recognize. I didn't confront him. I just watched him. The slight tremor in his voice, the way he avoided eye contact, the rushed movements, all signs I would have missed before, but now felt glaring. And when he came home later, showering immediately without even saying hello, something in me snapped into sharper focus. I asked him about it, calmly, gently, and the way he snapped back caught me completely off guard. His defensiveness was instant, almost rehearsed, and the irritation in his tone felt like a slap. If he had nothing to hide, why was he reacting as if I'd accused him of a crime? That question echoed louder than anything he actually said. And suddenly, the call no longer felt like a prank. It felt like someone had simply pointed a flashlight at a truth I'd been tiptoeing around for years. From that night on, I started paying attention in ways I never had before. Not obsessively, just clearly. I noticed the mileage on his car didn't match the distance to his office. I noticed receipts tucked in his pockets from places he'd never mentioned. Small things, everyday things, but when you line them up side by side, they start forming a picture you can't unsee. And honestly, that realization hurt far more than the anonymous call ever did. What haunted me most wasn't just the inconsistencies, it was the way he looked at me. Or rather, the way he stopped looking at me. His affection felt rehearsed, almost mechanical, like he was performing the role of a husband instead of actually being one. I'd catch him staring at his phone when he thought I wasn't watching, typing quickly, smiling faintly, then locking the screen the second I got too close. And every time he said big project, his voice held less warmth and more distance. I kept telling myself I needed proof before letting my heart break completely. I had spent so many years building a life with this man, believing in him, trusting him, that admitting something was wrong felt like tearing down a house brick by brick with my bare hands. But the more I observed, the more it felt like I'd been living in a home with cracks I simply hadn't noticed. And those cracks were widening faster than I could pretend to ignore. There was one moment, in particular, that sealed something inside me. I walked into the living room and asked, as gently as I could, if he wanted to have dinner together the next night. Something simple, something normal. And instead of answering, he flinched. Actually flinched, like my voice had startled him. Then he muttered something about deadlines and needing space. Space. From the woman who had stood by him through everything. That word sat in my chest like a stone. And it was in that moment I realized how alone I felt. Even with him standing just a few feet away, there was a heaviness in the house that hadn't existed before. A kind of invisible fog settling over everything we once shared. I'd catch myself looking at our wedding photo on the wall, remembering the man who used to hold me like I was the safest place he knew. Now, he could barely hold eye contact for 10 seconds without looking uncomfortable. The more the days passed, the more the anonymous caller felt less like a stranger, and more like someone who had simply handed me a truth I wasn't brave enough to face on my own. And as much as it terrified me, I knew I couldn't keep living in this half-lit version of my marriage, standing in the dark, waiting for the pieces to fall where they may. Something inside me was preparing for the moment I would stop wondering and start finding out for myself. The night I finally decided to follow him, my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel just to steady myself. I kept telling myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, that I was simply confirming what my heart already suspected, but it still felt like crossing an invisible line. I drove with my headlights off, staying far enough behind him that he wouldn't notice, watching his taillights cut through the darkness like a trail I never wanted to follow. Every mile felt heavier than the last. He didn't take the highway toward the office. He didn't even head in the direction of any project site he had ever mentioned. Instead, he drove across town, straight toward a part of the city where couples go when they don't want to be seen. The closer we got, the louder my heartbeat became, pounding against my ribs like it was trying to warn me, or protect me. When he finally pulled into a hotel parking lot, I felt this strange mix of nausea and clarity wash over me at the same time. I parked far enough away to stay hidden, but close enough to see him step out of the car. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't stressed. He wasn't a man drowning in deadlines. He checked his reflection in the car window, smoothed his shirt, and stood there waiting, like someone preparing for a date. And that was the moment I realized the truth wasn't going to gently reveal itself. It was about to punch me in the chest. I didn't expect to see her. Honestly, I thought it would be some stranger, someone whose face meant nothing to me. But when that woman walked toward him, confident, smiling, almost glowing under the parking lot lights, my entire body froze. It took me a second to recognize her, but once I did, the shock hit so hard it felt physical. Livia. The ex he swore meant nothing. The one he said was just a mistake. The one he promised he never spoke to again. I watched them meet halfway, and the moment he wrapped his arms around her, something inside me cracked in a way I can't even put into words. They didn't just hug. They melted into each other like they'd been waiting for that moment all day. And when they kissed, deeply, familiar, passionately, my breath caught in my throat. I felt like the world around me blurred, as if the windshield fogged over from the heat of my heartbreak. I kept whispering, "No, no, no," even though I already knew. What made it worse wasn't just the betrayal. It was the ease of it, the comfort, the routine. They kissed like lovers who had never stopped being together. And as I sat there in my car, hands trembling over my mouth, tears spilling before I even felt them, I realized I wasn't watching a moment of weakness. I was watching a pattern. A story they had been living while I was busy believing in ours. And the pain of that truth settled into something colder, sharper, something that felt disturbingly close to resolve. Sitting there in that parking lot, I felt my entire world tilt, like someone had pulled a thread I didn't realize was holding everything together. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady the storm inside me, but the betrayal hit in waves. Shock, disbelief, rage, heartbreak, all crashing at once. My mind kept replaying every time he'd left the house with that same shirt, that same smile, that same effortless lie. And with every passing second, the innocence of our marriage slipped further away from me. At one point, I whispered to myself, "How long has this been happening?" It wasn't even a question I expected to answer. It was more like an acknowledgement of something deeper, something that had been hiding in plain sight. I thought of the nights he avoided my eyes, the rushed goodbyes, the sudden showers, the defensiveness. They weren't random moments. They were breadcrumbs, and I had finally followed them to the truth he never wanted me to see. Somewhere between the heartbreak and the shaking, something else took shape inside me. Something fierce, focused, strangely calm. It was like grief made room for clarity, and clarity made room for intention. I wiped my tears, straightened my posture, and stared at the hotel entrance with a new kind of strength. If he wanted to play games in the dark, fine. But I wasn't going to stay in the dark with him. Not anymore. And in that silence, that cold determination became the first spark of something I never expected: revenge. When I got home that night, I wasn't the same woman who had left the driveway hours earlier. The heartbreak was still there, raw and burning, but it had settled beneath something sharper. I walked through the house slowly, almost methodically, noticing how quiet it felt, how empty. It was strange, really, how betrayal can turn a familiar home into a stage where every object suddenly looks like evidence. And in a way, that's exactly what it became, because I knew what I had to do. I went straight to my office drawer, the one James always said was too cluttered to deal with. That's where I kept everything: old receipts, documents, random papers that never had a proper home. But buried in that mess was something I hadn't touched in years: our prenuptial agreement. I took it out with hands that were still trembling, though not from sadness anymore. From focus. I sat down, turned on the lamp, and read every line like a lawyer preparing for trial. And there it was, the clause he never thought I'd remember. The clause he insisted on adding because he said it was just formality, something to protect us both. But it protected only me. If he cheated, I received 80% of our shared assets. Not 50, not 60, 80. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of irony settle over me. He had signed his own downfall years before ever stepping foot into that hotel. And now, all I had to do was gather proof and let the truth do the rest. The next day, while James was working late, I started gathering everything I needed. I printed the photos I'd taken of him and Livia kissing in that parking lot. Every angle, every moment that revealed exactly who they were when they thought no one was watching. I took screenshots of the messages he'd sent me about his so-called overtime shifts, each one contradicting the work logs I pulled from his company portal. Every inconsistency became a puzzle piece I carefully placed on the table. It felt surreal, collecting evidence against the man I once believed would protect my heart forever. But strangely, I didn't fall apart the way I expected. Instead, I felt a kind of calm settle over me, a clarity that only comes when the truth finally tears through the fog. With every document, every photo, every printed record, I felt myself reclaiming pieces of the woman I had lost while loving him. And that version of me, the one who didn't tolerate lies, was finally waking up again. That night, when James walked through the door acting like nothing had changed, I saw him differently. He smiled at me, kissed my cheek, tossed his keys on the counter. The whole routine so painfully scripted. And instead of breaking, I found myself observing him the way one might observe a character in a play, detached, almost analytical. He had no idea the curtain was about to fall on his performance. And honestly, watching him move around our home with such confidence only made what came next feel even more satisfying. When he finally sat down on the couch, scrolling through his phone like nothing in the world could possibly be wrong, I stood there watching him with a stillness I didn't know I was capable of. My heart wasn't racing anymore. My hands weren't shaking. It was as if every emotion I'd felt in that parking lot had crystallized into a single focused purpose. So I walked over, placed the folder on the coffee table, and said, "James, we need to talk." He looked up at me, surprised, almost offended that I would interrupt his evening. The moment he opened the folder, I watched his expression shift in slow motion. Confusion, panic, guilt. And then that desperate attempt at control, the one cheaters cling to when they realize the truth has outrun their lies. He stuttered, reaching for excuses faster than he could form them, insisting it meant nothing, that he had slipped, that he was under stress. But I just stared at him, refusing to offer even a single tear. I wanted him to feel the silence. I wanted him to drown in it. And then, when he thought he had convinced me to talk calmly, I placed the prenup on top of the photos. That was the moment everything inside him collapsed. His face drained of color as he recognized his own signature at the bottom of the page. He whispered my name like it was a plea, like he suddenly remembered I mattered. But I wasn't the heartbroken wife anymore. I was the woman he underestimated, the one he didn't think would ever look up from her trust long enough to see the truth. And now? Now I had everything I needed to make sure he never forgot it. The next morning, I walked into my lawyer's office with every piece of evidence neatly organized, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. She flipped through the documents slowly, nodding with that calm certainty only professionals have. When she looked up and said, "Rachel, this is airtight," something inside me loosened, a knot I didn't even realize had been tightening for years. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was reclaiming my life step by step. By evening, the papers were ready, neatly stapled, perfectly formatted, carrying the weight of every lie he ever told. When James received them, he stormed into the house like a thundercloud, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. His anger didn't scare me anymore. If anything, it confirmed exactly who he had been becoming. He waved the divorce papers at me like they were some kind of insult. "You're leaving me over one mistake?" he shouted. One mistake. Hearing him say that almost made me laugh. I didn't shout back. I didn't cry. I simply continued packing his suitcase, placing each shirt and tie inside with a quiet deliberation that unnerved him far more than any argument. He kept pacing, kept begging, kept accusing, cycling through every tactic meant to make me doubt myself. But I felt strangely steady, like a woman standing on solid ground while someone else tried desperately to cling to sinking sand. And for once, he realized I wasn't going to be pulled under with him. At one point, he tried to switch strategies, softening his voice the way he used to when he wanted to get out of trouble. "Rachel, please, I'll stop seeing her. I swear." The desperation in his eyes might have moved me once, but not now. Not after knowing how easily he'd lied while looking at me with that same expression. I closed the suitcase with a steady hand and looked him directly in the eyes. For the first time in months, he blinked first. He tried again, this time grasping for control. "You can't take everything," he insisted, voice cracking as the reality started hitting him. And that was when I held up the prenup, the contract he had pushed for, the one he thought he'd never have to worry about. Watching the color drain from his face was like watching a mask dissolve. He wasn't angry anymore. He was scared. Truly, deeply scared in a way I had never seen before. And I don't think he realized how much that moment said about the man he really was. I told him the truth he never expected to hear. "I'm not leaving because of Livia. I'm leaving because you thought I was stupid." The silence that followed was heavy, thick, almost suffocating. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, because there was nothing left for him to manipulate. No version of the story he could twist, no excuse strong enough to rewrite what he had done. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the ground shift in my favor. When I opened the front door and pointed outside, he hesitated like a child who suddenly realized the game was over. "Go to Livia," I said softly, not with anger, but with a calm so solid it felt like armor. "She's the only thing you have left." He stood there for a moment, eyes wide, chest heaving, trying to understand how the woman he thought he controlled had become the one shutting the door on his entire future. And then finally, he stepped out. Not defiantly, not confidently, but defeated. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the silence was loud. Not empty or sad, just different. New. I walked back into the house, feeling the weight of the past few months lift from my shoulders like a heavy coat. I had finally decided I didn't need any more. The pictures on the walls, the dishes in the sink, the faint smell of dinner from the night before. Everything looked the same, yet everything felt transformed. Because now the home wasn't a stage for a lie. It was mine again. I stood in the middle of the living room, letting the stillness wrap around me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on someone else's choices. The real kind. The kind that grows when you save yourself. And as strange as it sounded, I found myself silently thanking that anonymous caller. Their voice didn't just expose his betrayal. It handed me back my freedom. And I knew, deep in my bones, that I wasn't walking into loneliness now. I was walking into my own life again.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.